There we go. And then the one last thing is that if you have questions, you are encouraged to type them into the chat box, and Leslie will get to them at the end. Although she will be covering a lot of commonly asked questions during her presentation, you still may have one that she doesn't touch. Okay, and the one last favor I have to ask is that everyone keep your microphones off when you're not speaking to reduce background noise. So if everyone can mute, and I might actually go in and mute you myself if I don't see that you're muted. Well, now so we've got a 12, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Leslie. I have the distinct pleasure this evening of introducing Leslie Phillips, who is not only one of our NEST board members, she has a PhD and is an epidemiologist specializing in clinical epidemiology, research study design and analysis, COVID-19 response, and best practices for data collection. Accomplished in helping organizations navigate complex epidemiologic questions, Leslie provides insight and support to better understanding the ME/CFS, I should have asked what that meant, and the post-COVID landscape. Leslie holds a master's degree in public health from Harvard University and a doctorate in epidemiology from the University of Washington. She has served in a variety of analytic and leadership capacities in research and public health, and in addition to epidemiology, has expertise in survey research, health equity, population health, and lean startup methodologies. I just have to say that we are incredibly lucky to have her on our board. As a Seattle resident through more than 20 gray wet winters, Leslie has developed an excessive addiction to coffee and an impressive collection of Gore-Tex. And that is all I'm going to say, and I'm going to turn things over to you, Leslie. Thank you again for being here.
Thanks, Emily. I'm so glad to be here. You would think after 2 years that this is a topic that might grow old, but it doesn't grow old, nor does the virus seem to go away. And that's part of what we'll talk about tonight. I'm going to, as Emily said, address some commonly asked questions. And then I got one question from one of you before we started, and then I'll loop back. You can put questions in the chat, or if you want to wait and just ask them when we're done. I certainly don't mind if you interrupt if you have a pressing question that relates to slides, but I hope that maybe I predicted some of your questions. We will see soon. All right, we're going to talk about COVID-19 and Omicron during this ongoing pandemic today. So I thought I'd start off just to contextualize where we are. This graph wasn't the graph I think many of us who are epidemiologists were expecting to see a year ago. We expected that there might be a bit more of a roller coaster and that there would be surges, but obviously the Omicron surge is really startling in its magnitude of cases.
Leslie,
yeah.
This is Lori, and,
yeah.
I'm here on the phone. So when you have slides, can you please describe them?
Yeah, you bet. I'll do my best. So this slide looks like, a line that goes up and down, and then it goes straight up. So that's how I describe it. And it's a slide for the United States daily cases. I have a similar slide I'm showing now that's Washington State. And I would say that overall Washington State kind of mirrors the national trend. I would say one distinct thing that is interesting about Washington State is that we actually got hit harder by Delta than prior surges, which it wasn't true of the country and isn't true of all regions.
Leslie, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, please.
You're describing slides and I'm not seeing any. All I have is the introductory title, COVID-19 Omicron and ongoing pandemic.
Oh, no.
Thank you. Yeah.
My goodness.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I sent you a message. We're not in slideshow view. Sorry about that.
Oh, how interesting. Okay.
Yeah, we see the back end. I'm sorry.
No, let me try something. I'm going to try to pull this. I'm working with two screens and I don't know that I've presented that way. Can you see the second slide that says national trends now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Now I'm going to do something risky. I'm going to go to the slideshow view to make this bigger. And it's possible we'll lose it, in which case I'll do it in this format, but hopefully we won't. Okay. Do you see national trends?
Yeah,
Yes.
but it's not the slideshow view. It's still the like back end where we can see all your slides on the left-hand side.
How strange. Okay, so I'm just gonna focus on not being in slideshow view, and at some point I will
Okay.
figure out how to do that. I don't have anything but the slides, so there's nothing that you're missing. It's just a little less large, but thanks so much for alerting me. So well, I'll just kind of show you the actual graph rather than describe it. There you see national trends. You can look at this, looks very similar to Washington state trends, except for here, right here we have Delta, and Delta hit us harder. So Omicron and vaccines or prior infection. I think this is a question I get a lot, and it relates to a question that came before the talk, which I'll also can talk about a little bit now. But first of all, you know, if you've had a prior infection with COVID-19, or if you've been vaccinated, it sure seems like you can still get Omicron, and that is absolutely true. So what is the benefit of the vaccine? The benefit of the vaccine is in the severity of the illness. It will, to some extent, prevent you from getting a symptomatic infection. But even when it doesn't do that, it does a great job at preventing severe infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. And I'll pause to address the question that came before this meeting, which I thought is really good and is one I get a lot. If someone has had a natural infection with COVID-19, do they have immunity, and for how long? And what I will say is that both vaccines and natural infection lead to immunity. I will also say that both vaccines and natural infection do not have sterilizing immunity. That's kind of a term we use for immunity for the life course, that they wane over time. We don't know the exact time course. We'd rather be more than less conservative and boost before we need a boost. But somebody who has been naturally infected over time will need a boost. The duration of immunity is estimated to be anything from 90 days at the very minimum to out to 18 months, with most people feeling very comfortable that, you know, 6 months after an infection, that there is somewhat robust immunity. But like the vaccinations, it won't be forever. And so that's where vaccination has a role, even in those who've had a prior infection. I love these graphics from the New York Times. Like they're so kind of clean and simple. And these graphics are going to talk about the test. You probably are aware of different types of tests. So they're the tests that relatively recently you could buy at the grocery store or drugstore. They're rapid antigen tests. You take them home, you swab your nostril, you add some reagent, you wait 15 minutes, and it gives you a positive or negative. You've also probably heard that these tests are not as sensitive as the PCR test. And the PCR test is based on the genetic material in the virus, and that is essentially amplified over and over to try to detect an infection. And they do tend to be very sensitive. So when should you use one versus the other, I think is a common question people have. And then does Omicron change that? So the rapid test, I like to call them a day pass. If you're going to a dinner party that night, that's a good time, you know, before you head out of the house, to take that rapid test. Maybe if you're hosting, ask your friends to take those rapid tests as well. And it does not guarantee that nobody is showing up with a COVID-19 infection. But what it does is it dramatically reduces the risk of someone not being detected who has a COVID-19 infection that is transmissible at that particular time. That's what rapid tests are really good at. This point in time, when you have enough viral load in your nose, both to be transmissible to other people and to pick it up on that test. PCR test would be a really good test, say, you're flying out to see a relative, maybe that a relative is somebody who is at high risk for severe complications of COVID-19. You can know with much more certainty with a PCR test, you know, kind of 2 days before you get infected, that infection is coming. So that's a good time to take a PCR test. A bad time to take a PCR test is maybe 10 days after you've been infected and you're not symptomatic, because at this time, essentially the test is so sensitive that it's kind of picking up the viral debris. It's like the COVID-19 virus came, it infected you, it made you sick. It's now left the scene of the crime, but it left its fingerprints behind. And that's what you're seeing there. It's almost, at that sense, more forensic than diagnostic. And so we'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide when we talk about isolation periods. The graph at the bottom really is just talking about how Omicron really leads to someone being infectious earlier in the course of disease than we've seen with the other variants. And that might be part of its success at spreading so rapidly. I don't know, I'm not a Twitter user, and you might not be either, but I was sent a whole series of these and they were so much fun. They were basically a play on CDC advice. So they went something like, the CDC says, the CDC now recommends. You can see the one on the right. The CDC sets quarantine duration to 7 Mississippi. I saw a similar one. CDC says your lunch break can be your quarantine too. You know, this idea that this is a changing and moving target. And how could something that was 14 days at the start now really be 5 days? Is this trustworthy? And I think the key to this is a few things, that the science changes, and as it changes, we learn more and we try to get more refined in our approach. But also, I think that if you look at the CDC guidance on this, it is not you get sick and you isolate for 5 days. There's some real specificity to it. So first of all, do you count day 1 as the day you get the symptoms, you get the test? How do you do that? So you have to know how to count the days. And the way you count the days is if you have symptoms, the first day of your symptoms, that's day 0. So that doesn't even count. And if you're asymptomatic, the day you were swabbed for a test that becomes positive is also day 0. And then you count 5 days from there. And then on that 6th day, CDC says it is okay to go out into the world if you have no symptoms, or this is the part I don't love so much, your symptoms are resolving. I think my resolving symptoms could be your sick day. So I wish there was more clarity around that. I would advise anyone who has symptoms not to go back out into the world. And they also say don't travel and to wear a mask for 5 more days anytime you are somewhere outside of your home until you get to that 10-day mark. A lot of questions were asked about, well, why didn't the CDC do what some other countries did, which is require people to test out of isolation? To that, I would say, have you tried to find a COVID-19 test lately? I mean, to some extent, you have to be practical in public health policy. And while the UK did have a test out of isolation, they also had a lot more supply. What I would say is, if you or someone you know gets COVID and you can get an antigen test, that is extra assurance that at day 6, you're ready to go out into the world. A PCR test, again, you could be picking up that kind of viral debris, those dead nucleotides that don't mean that you're sick or transmissible, but rather that you've had a prior infection. So for testing out, if you can find an antigen test, that's a great way to get that extra degree of assurance. All right, this is a fun graphic, little boy in the back seat. All of us parents have heard this. Are we there yet? I don't have great answers for you, but I'll tell you what I see on the horizon, with the note that I spoke to this group almost exactly a year ago. My predictions didn't quite pan out, so take them for what they're worth. We do hope to have vaccines for very young children, those under age 5, sometime in the next few months. Essentially, when those trials were done, they keep lowering the dose. So the dose for those under 12 is 1/3 of the dose for those of adults. And I think the under 5 set may even be 1/3 of that. It's certainly less. And what they found is that 2 doses wasn't effective enough. So they are continuing those trials to find, is 3 doses effective? Do they need to change the dosing? And I think we'll have that answer soon. And that will be very good news for parents of young children. New vaccines are being made with the variants code. What I mean by the code is I think of the mRNA vaccine as kind of the instructions you get when you go to IKEA, and those instructions go to your body and they say, hey, here's how you build this spike protein. And then your body builds the spike protein. And should you become infected, it says, aha, I recognize you. I've got the weapons to take you down. That spike protein is where we're seeing a lot of mutations. So if you change the code or the IKEA instructions and you build spike proteins that are more like the variants we're seeing, then you are more likely to have better resistance to breakthrough infections, and of course also any level of severity, a higher level of severity with that. Of course, this is always like you feel behind the 8 ball, like it's a hard thing to do, because by the time a variant comes around, there is a process for changing and producing those vaccines. And while it is reasonably short, it is still months, not weeks. And these variants tend to move pretty fast. I think the Olympics is on the horizon. I just find it interesting. China has maintained its zero COVID policy. And if you read some of the regulations they've put into place for the Olympics, they are fascinating. I mean, on the order of, if you are in the Olympic bubble, or if you are a bystander and somebody in the Olympic bubble is in an automobile accident, do not render aid if you are outside that bubble. I mean, their efforts to go to zero COVID are notable, and to date have been pretty successful. Omicron is very different. And also the vaccines they're using are very different than the vaccines we have used here, and are probably not as efficacious. So just watching how hard they are trying to have a safe Olympics. You may have heard that the FDA removed its emergency use authorization for 2 of the 3 monoclonal antibodies. That was done because it was found that those particular treatments were not effective against Omicron. And a lot of states have started to shut down sort of their centers for doing monoclonal antibodies. But monoclonal antibodies are tough, right? I mean, you have to go in, you have to be in an inpatient setting for some period of time. It's an infused therapy. The key is oral antivirals, and we have 2. And one is especially effective and neither is especially available. So there's a whole process of how people can get these, and they have to be high risk. And in fact, for that reason, unvaccinated persons are prioritized for this, which I suspect many will find frustrating. Certainly not a gift to those who have, done the right thing and been vaccinated, but definitely a gift to our medical system that is definitely feeling the weight of this pandemic. And I think that's another common question I get is, if Omicron is so much milder than prior variants, why are our hospitals straining? And I will say not all hospitals are straining, but certainly we are seeing that in at least the Washington region. And I will say, if you have a variant that is 10 times as transmissible, but with 1/10 the severity of prior variants, that's a wash. Your hospitals still get overwhelmed. And the last thing I'll talk about is endemicity, like going from pandemic to endemic. What does that mean? What does that look like? First of all, I'll tell you that there are lots of diseases that are endemic. It doesn't mean that they don't cause death and some fear and concern for public health authorities. But what they are less likely to do is to surprise us. We have an expectation that we will have some level of flu every year. There are years we have flu pandemics. That means we've gone beyond that expected level of flu. But in most years, we expect flu to be on the horizon. And, we're going to have to think about COVID-19 as like the flu. The flu can be very dangerous. The flu certainly can be and is lethal, but it is something we learn to incorporate in our lives. And that is the direction that COVID-19 will certainly go. Will it be seasonal like the flu? Other coronaviruses certainly seem to be, but we have seen COVID in the summer too. So we'll see how that plays out. So now I'm going to get to some of the questions you sent me in advance. I thought this was a great question. What information is available about Omicron transmission outdoors, like when you're near and with other people? So outdoors is the ultimate ventilation. The virus, essentially kind of dilutes itself in open air. That doesn't mean there are no documented cases of outdoor transmission. There have been, and I will talk about them. But there's sort of special circumstances. What I will say is I could not find any articles about Omicron specifically, though I have no reason to believe that Omicron would differ in this respect. And that is that in general, transmission is dramatically less likely outdoors. And the exceptions tend to be kind of one of two scenarios that have been documented. The first is really close face-to-face conversation. And the second is sort of an upstream downstream effect. So running partners, where somebody's in front of someone talking and breathing back that air, that can be an exposure risk. But in general, walking by someone on the street, even with something very infectious like Omicron, is not a concern. It's these close contact interactions that are most likely to present a risk. This one, this was one stumped me because I hadn't had this question before, so it was nice to get, and it allowed me to do a little research, which is, are Omicron symptoms different for older adults? What I will say is Omicron still remains new enough that we don't have an answer specific to Omicron, but there is a literature on this for COVID-19 in general. And there are two pieces to that. One is just case reports. It's essentially clinicians saying, I've noticed that my patients over the age of 60, 70, 80 are more likely to be dehydrated, feel apathy, disoriented, confused, sleepier, less likely to eat or talk, more likely to fall and experience dizziness. These are not, studies per se. These are sort of anecdotal observations. There was a study done using machine learning to kind of look at how things looked differently for those in the 60 to 79-year-old age group versus those who were younger. And they did notice some distinct clinical presentation differences. And you can see those here, spelled the British way because this was in the Lancet, but that they had different symptoms: chest pain, shortness of breath, and unusual muscle pain for 60 to 79-year-olds. And then the over 80-year-olds were compared to those. Sorry, it wasn't younger or older. It was 60 to 79 versus older. And they had these symptoms of diarrhea, sore throat, chest pain, unusual muscle pain. So some of them are the same and some of them are different. But I think that there are some different presentations in older adults. I have not seen anything specific to Omicron, however. I also thought this was a great question. Probably if you attended my talk last year, I probably talked about what I call robust masking. And that's the idea that not all masks are created equally. I think we've known this for a while. And finally, CDC, especially with the infectiousness of Omicron, has said this, which I think is great. N95, KN95, the Korean version is KF94. So if you wear one of these to the grocery store, do you have to throw it away, or is it safe to use again? Technically, these masks were intended for single use. In reality, CDC says with the N95, it's fine to wear it up to 5 times. I think people, even clinicians I know, often reuse these masks. Cases where you want to replace the mask, let's say you've been wearing the mask and you notice it's looser. Part of the way these masks work is they create a seal. So if it's looser, you're not going to get the same benefit. If it's soiled, if it gets wet, if you see any degradation, if it's just been a long time, these are indicators to replace the mask. But for usual daily wear in relatively low risk situations like going to the grocery store, I think it's absolutely fine. I certainly, in my case, I reuse my KN95 when I go in. If I get on an airplane, guess what? I'm opening up a new one and going more robust in that situation. So it also helps to think about the situation. If people are wearing masks and social distancing, how are they getting the flu? I think this question sort of implies if we're doing all these things for COVID, how is flu getting through? But actually, flu activity is quite a bit down compared to a typical winter and falling. And so the question is, well, what about all these people who are getting tested for COVID who get a negative test? And I will say, flu is very specific. They might have flu, but flu-like illness describes just a multitude of bugs and viruses that lead to fever, cough, headache, chills, fatigue. We've all had these types of symptoms at some point in our lives. Sometimes they're flu, sometimes they're not. But winter is a time of many bugs. So, but this winter, when you look at flu surveillance data, first of all, it is down for January compared to December, but it is also down compared to a typical flu year. And that probably is because of the precautions we take for COVID-19 also work well for flu. And before I stop sharing, I'll just leave. If you have any questions and you want to follow up with me by email, you're welcome to. My email address is leslie@wearedatadriven.com. And I am going to try to stop sharing, which I always find challenging. Let's see. Great. And then I'll check the chat for some questions. How does the severity and length of long COVID compare? Yep. So I'll read it for anyone on the phone. How does the severity and length of long COVID compare among Delta and Omicron and other variants that emerge? You heard at the beginning, there was the ME-CFS piece that came out in my biography, and that is related to something called myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome. And Emily said, oh, I should have checked that out, but there was no reason to check that out. That is we think in many cases, a post-viral condition that does not resolve for whatever reason. And that's what we're seeing with long COVID. So the question here is, does long COVID differ by variant? I have not seen that, but even if it did differ for Omicron, it is too soon to know. The definition of long COVID, of course, is having persistent symptoms and not going back to that baseline state, not for a matter of weeks, but for a matter of months. And we just don't have those data yet. There was a really interesting article published in the journal Cell, I think on Tuesday, and it was the first article to come out and talk about how do people with long COVID look different than people who don't get long COVID. And we need a lot more data on this, but they did identify some characteristics of likelihood of having long COVID. So it's interesting. I can follow up with all four. I remember one of them was having type 2 diabetes, and there were a variety of other ones that had to do with viral load. Some of these things you might know about yourself, others you might not, but we're starting to try to crack that code of why do some people not get better. Can you talk about the numbers that seem to be decreasing in Seattle 105 and 115 zip codes? I should say that I am not necessarily hyperlocal when I look at the numbers. I do think, we have, if you look at the school, Seattle School has a lovely map on its website that kind of shows you each school and where and how many COVID cases they have. And there are absolutely clusters, and we do see these clusters in certain regions. I can't necessarily explain them. I think we do have, different levels of vaccination throughout the city. There are different socio-demographics where perhaps in some poor parts of Seattle, parents who are essential workers have to go to work and be exposed, and therefore might expose their children bring it to school, these sorts of things. I'm guessing for 105 and 115 that you have a different socioeconomic status that might mean that people are able to limit their exposure, but that's completely a guess. I'm not really familiar with those data, but it's interesting. Emily, I'm glad you're relieved about ME-CFS. Once exposed to Omicron, and how many days can I expect to have symptoms? It's funny, I had a friend who said, I was going to go visit my brother, but he went to this wedding yesterday, so I'm not going over there because I could get Omicron. And I said to her, no, you should go today because he's not going to be getting Omicron and passing it on to you today. That's going to take at least a couple of days. But Omicron does move fast. It doesn't move that fast. You're not going to transmit it within 24 hours of being exposed. But you might start to feel symptoms on day 2 or day 3 if you're going to be symptomatic. It could be later than that, but that's kind of the early end of it. And 3 days doesn't seem to be atypical, which is quite a bit shorter than we saw sort of early on in the pandemic, where we were seeing closer to 5 days. What is the chance that we will get COVID? Everyone's going to either be vaccinated or naturally infected at some point. So I think that that's worth thinking about. Most of us have had flu, even though there are flu shots. So I think, over time, if we're lucky to live long enough, it would not be shocking if most of us did get some form of COVID. Hopefully at the point it's endemic and hopefully mild because we've built up immunity with vaccines over time. That's a great question. How is transmissibility measured? It's interesting because there have been a lot of questions about why is Omicron so much more transmissible. One of the reasons that was identified early had to do with viral load. People had more virus in their nose, and that must be it. And then there was a study that came out earlier this month. No, that's not it. And then it's sort of like maybe it's more transmissible because you have vaccinated people who can get it. So in prior variants, it wasn't possible for someone vaccinated to get it. But they weren't as vulnerable. And in Omicron doesn't seem to care a huge amount about your vaccine status. So that in itself makes it more transmissible. Transmissibility is measured by the secondary attack rate. What that means is the number of people that one infected person passes the disease onto. There are different types of secondary attack rates. You can look at within households, or you can look at close contacts. But I will say the secondary attack rate for both with Omicron is higher than it was in Delta and prior variants. If a person gets COVID now, how long they need to wait to get a booster again? I don't think we have the answer to that because we tend to measure booster related to like what's ideal related in terms of vaccine. You've had a vaccine, when do you need a booster? That said, there is no, once you're fine and you're recovered from COVID, there's not believed to be any risk to getting your vaccine immediately. Would the vaccine be more effective if you waited longer? I think that's the data we don't have. And I know we're talking about a booster here, but there's no risk to getting the COVID vaccine right after you recover. There's also no risk to getting the COVID and the flu vaccine at the same time. And there's also not too late to have the flu vaccine anytime in kind of winter, early spring. So it's not too late to get that vaccine if you have not and you're interested. These are great questions. Oh, I missed this one. Are there other variants on the horizon, and are there likely, feel free to chime in if I miss your question. Are there likely to be more variants in the future? Absolutely, there will be more variants. How do variants happen? I like to think of variants as typos, right? The virus keeps replicating and sometimes it makes the small mistake. Most of the time, the small mistake is inconsequential. You can read that document with typo in it, but sometimes it really changes things. And when it changes things in ways which are deleterious, at least to people, not so much to viruses, for instance, leads to more severe disease, leads to more transmissibility, is able to evade our vaccines and treatments, we call it a variant of concern, and we award it a Greek letter of the alphabet. So there is this variant on the horizon that is called, I don't know what it doesn't get its own Greek letter because it's it's quite related to Omicron, but they're calling it stealth Omicron because on a PCR test, you can't distinguish it from other variants. Clinically, it appears so far the data suggests that it manifests, like Omicron. It's just harder to see in surveillance data. As far as are there variants in the future, the way we get variants is through massive amounts of replication. At some point, you're going to have some error that matters. And we have not vaccinated the world, and we don't have high levels of immunity throughout the world, right? That's not an equitable, we didn't have an equitable vaccine rollout. And even as we increase access, we may not have vaccine uptake enough to reduce the level of reproduction of the virus that makes variants no longer a risk. So I think we will have other variants on the horizon. Will they cause the disruption that Omicron has caused? I hope not. I hope it's more like a pandemic flu year. Where do we get the N95 masks and how much do they cost? You should be careful. This is a great question because N95 masks, because they are expensive, and I don't know the price, but dollars per mask versus, cents with a surgical mask. Because there's a profit there, unfortunately, there are fraudulent masks. There are ways to spot fraudulent N95s. And I have some information I can share by email afterwards. I'll make a note to share that with Chris and Emily so they can get it out to you so you can vet it. But actually, Amazon has some good ones that have been certified by NIOSH. And N95 is one of the protective masks, but there are also KN95s and KF94s. And there are a series of places that you can buy those as well. And I think the big thing with all of them is if you're seeing claims like kills 100% of viruses and bacteria, you should, if it sounds too good to be true, if they're trying to sell you that mask very hard, you should be suspicious. And I will go ahead and send that after this meeting because I have a whole list because I don't like the idea of fraudulent mask. And will more boosters be recommended? I didn't address that. Yeah, I think we'll have to get boosters on a regular basis. I think the question is, it's not sustainable for us to get a booster every 5 months, right? Which is what it was after that second shot. And I don't think that's what it will be, but we will see. Will it be annual? Will the boosters change with the variants like the flu vaccine changes? Probably, but we'll know that, as things play out, but we will need more boosters. That seems very likely. Oh yeah, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Washington State has an app that can notify someone if they've been exposed to COVID-19. I was exposed and the contact was for less than 15 minutes. Is that considered low risk? That is a great question. And it's actually a question I'm going to answer differently today than I would have, say, 2 months ago. And I'll tell you why. The CDC has what I will call an operational definition of close contact, right? I mean, you have to draw the line somewhere. And here's where they draw the line. If you have been in proximity of someone within 6 feet, for 15 minutes or more cumulatively over a 24-hour period, then you have had a close contact. And CDC doesn't actually consider you exposed unless you are close contact. They don't think, for instance, if you vaccinated people don't have to quarantine, but if you were unvaccinated and you were exposed for less than 15 minutes or at a distance of greater than 6 feet, you would not be considered someone who was a close contact, and therefore you would not have to quarantine. So that leads to the question, are people infected outside of 6 feet? Almost certainly. Are they infected in less than 15 minutes? Almost certainly. And with something like Omicron, we know that secondary attack rate is higher. And while I've said throughout the pandemic, dose makes the poison, you want to kind of limit the duration of exposure. I haven't seen any clear data on what it is for Omicron, but I think given its level of infectiousness, it would not be surprising, for instance, if what required for a prior variant 15 minutes took 5 with this one. Well, I don't know that to be a fact. Is that sort of exposure low risk? It's lower risk than the alternative, but it's not no risk. Another question from a member: has the Omicron variant made homemade cloth masks obsolete? I don't think Omicron did it. I think that that was probably, I don't know about obsolete. Right now, you might go to QFC and people might glare at you if you're wearing a homemade mask because they think you're putting them at risk. But is that any different than it was with Delta? I think the thing about cloth masks is that they're variable, right? If you get a surgical mask, you know what you're getting. It may not be the most protective mask, but if it's a true surgical mask, it's got 3 layers, it straps around the ears, etc. If it's a true N95, it straps behind the head, and it has certain properties that have been tested. With a homemade mask or a cloth mask, it could be, I have one, my son goes to college at the University of Arizona, so it has like the University of Arizona. It's 1 layer. It is what I call a vanity mask. I bought it because it was fun. I never thought it would protect me. I would never wear that mask for protection. I might wear it over a surgical mask, perhaps, that has some more protection. There are some really robust cloth masks with multiple layers and nose clips that probably do create a seal and probably do offer a vast amount of protection, but they haven't been studied and tested to do so. And therefore, I think it's hard for public health agencies and professionals to say, yes, cloth masks are okay, because it's such a broad category, but it's a great question. You're welcome. It's fun. If you can't tell, I love to talk about viruses, this one in particular.
So we do have time for a few more questions. If anyone has anything that they're just, can't wait to get off your chest. And I think at this point, if it's easier for you to use your mic than to type in, because I know I'm not the fastest typist in the world. So go ahead and unmute yourself, and you can go ahead and ask a question as well.
So I've got another question. You were saying that, I can't remember what you said, after X amount of time, we should be changing masks that we wear. Mm-hmm. And so my question is like, if I'm out and about, I change it twice a day, there's $6 that I spent. And if I do that 3 times a week, that's like $20 times 4 weeks is like $80 a month. And then I don't know, from now until 10 years from now, that's really a lot of money to invest in. It's a health related item, but it's still very costly.
No, it's a great point. And actually, I think that what I will say about this administration is they are aware of the costs. And one of the places to get a good N95 when there is better supply, other than, I don't know if you've used the link to request your N95s by mail, but if not, that's something I can send out after this. And I was amazed. I expected the site to be really hard to navigate or overcrowded. It was super easy. So I recommend that. And then some drugstores are going to be giving them away. To your question specifically, while we wait, CDC has said explicitly on their site, and I'm sorry if I didn't clarify this, you can wear that mask up to 5 times. Should it be 5? Should it be 3? Should it be 6? We don't know. But for I have a group of doctors I meet with. I'm the only non-clinician in the group, and we met today. And we talked about this in particular because I knew it was a question that you all had for tonight. And he said, well, for civilian use, that's what he uses for people outside of the hospital. Like, I think it can be used, multiple times, but even within the hospital setting, clinicians are often reusing these masks. I don't think CDC or OSHA or the agencies would necessarily recommend that in a hospital environment, but I absolutely reuse my N95. And the only time I take out a new mask is when I'm in a high-risk environment. So for instance, if I had to go into an emergency room or something for a non-COVID related illness, I would take a new and fresh mask for that extra protection. Ditto air travel. But if you are trying to kind of, I think this is where common sense can dictate. If it's getting looser around your face, that's not good, right? Because things are going to come in and out the sides. If it's soil, if it's degraded in any way, that's time to replace it. But I don't think that anyone would say that they don't offer protection after one use, and it becomes just a level of risk tolerance. Probably every time you wear it, it's a little less protective. So CDC put the limit at 5. You may put the limit at 2 or 10. But I think very few people would recommend that it could be worn just once because of the reasons you state. It's a very robust mask and not an inexpensive one. I've seen Washington state and federal sites to get free at-home tests. I haven't seen a site to get free masks sent to my home. Is that federal or state? I believe that is federal, but I can check on that. I am, if you can't see it behind me, there's a basket behind me. It's a wash in masks, cloth masks, KN95s, everything. So I felt like I am not in need of a robust mask, so I didn't try to order them when the federal site came out, but I do think it is a federal program. Now, Washington state, and I know we have one Texan because it's my mom. So Texas, none of this applies to Texas, mom, because Texas does its own thing and it's not usually a public health policy. But in Washington state, often the state comes in to really do to mirror what the Fed is doing, but to make it more accessible, right? So they're increasing the supply of tests. They're going to perhaps increase the supply of masks. I don't know that to be the case, certainly with tests, as was noted in the question, and I can check. But for sure, there is a federal program to get, and that's very specific, I believe, to N95 masks. N95 masks are a very specific mask type that has been tested. And I'll let Emily chime in, but one more thing about these masks is that N95 masks are really for adults. There is no kid version. So if you have kids or grandkids in your life, there are smaller KN95s and KF94s for them. Emily?
So I'm by no means an expert, but there was an article in the New York Times and I think the Seattle Times last week that there will be masks provided by the government. They will not be mailing them to you. They will be given out at the sites where you got a vaccination. So if you went to a CVS or something like that. And we didn't include it in the member memo, last week, because they had not actually finalized all of the details, and especially the point that you brought up, Leslie, that they still don't know if they're going to, because there are no child size approved ones. So, but at least both articles did say that they will not be sending them, that you would have to go to a place where you got a vaccine. But I have not seen the final version of that, so please don't quote me on it.
That's super helpful information.
So anyone else here? Otherwise, I want to be respectful. Oh, did I hear a voice? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just coming up with this question as we're talking. There was discussion and it seemed pretty good clarity about air travel back in the earlier phases of the pandemic, like Delta. and so forth. But has Omicron changed the consideration of air travel, one, within the US, and two, internationally?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. What I will say is, while I told you I wear a more robust mask when I fly, it's less about the airplane than getting to the airplane. Security lines have signs like "please distance." I mean, come on, have you been to SeaTac lately? It's not happening. And I will say I've flown multiple, at least half a dozen times, probably 8 times in the last year. And once I was in my seat with the circulating air, and the flight attendants who, at least on Alaska, were pretty attentive to those who were not wearing masks, to the point where on my last flight, I think that was United, but they said, slip down your mask, take a sip, put it back up. I mean, they were quite serious. Of course, we've seen the air rage incidents, but it is when you're getting on the plane and the air isn't circulating and everyone's stuffing their thing into the overhead compartment and trying to move around, and you've got stale air in a small space. I think that is a risk. That doesn't address your questions, which is it more of a risk for Omicron? And I think, if we are correct in hypothesizing that maybe it takes Omicron, less virus, less time, less distance to infect you, then yes, it becomes more of a concern for any type of travel or any type of situation. As far as the international situation, I think that one is interesting because of required testing to get back into the United States. I had a coworker text me the other day, and she said, "Oh, I tested positive for COVID through the airline's testing. And now I can't get on the plane." And it was a rapid test. I said, "Well, you might want to get another rapid test. It's rare to be a false positive, but try another brand." I said, "You can stop by. I have some if you need them." And she said, "Oh no, I'm in Mexico." and I did go to get another test here, and it was also positive, but she felt completely well. The whole household of family she had been staying with all tested negative. And so what I think is interesting about Omicron and travel is you can be, of course, we always knew there was asymptomatic COVID-19, but there are estimates that as much as 80% of Omicron is asymptomatic. And so when you've got that level of asymptomatic infection, your chance of getting stuck somewhere because of it does certainly increase.
Thank you.
Sure. I'll just add that Terry, was it a year ago that I had the great excitement to take Terry to get his vaccine. It was so exciting for me because you were one of the first people I knew. It was like an epidemiologist dream come true.
Yes, well, and it was a patient's dream, or a civilian's dream come true, to not only have Nest volunteer or make happen the transporting me to get vaccinated, but it's by a very highly respected epidemiologist. So how much better does it get, right?
It was fun.
Yes, thank you.
So we kept the windows down the whole time, and it was very cold.
Yes, I remember.
All right. It's not that I'm trying to cut anyone off. I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're at 6:56. Any last takers before we let Leslie have her evening? Well, thank you so very much. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.